Hey everyone, Clio here, and it's time to talk about my October TBR. So I tried to make my September TBR less ambitious, but my October TBR is once again way too ambitious. So there are also quite some rereads in here that I'm starting to fear might get pushed aside because of what I have like as first time reads on here. But we'll see what ends up happening in October. So the first book on here is a reread. I was very excited when this read-along was announced. So there's a read-along being hosted by J.R.R. Foster. It runs from the 1st of October until the 23rd of October, and the goal is to read Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This is obviously a read-along being hosted with the goal of finishing this book before the movie comes out. I have already read Rebecca. I read it years ago. It's one of my favorite reads, but I mean, I must say, I read it so long ago that I don't remember too much about it. I remember the basic premise. So we're having this, our protagonist is not Rebecca, our protagonist is a woman who has just recently married this guy whose previous wife was Rebecca. And so when she moves into his house called Manderley, she kind of is haunted by the presence of Rebecca. There's no real haunting happening, but there's always this sort of feeling of like her having to compete with the former mistress, her not being good enough, like even staff and stuff like that seem to look down upon her. And so it has a great mysterious vibe to it, and I just remember absolutely loving this one. So it is one that has been on my to reread list for a very long time, and so I thought this is the time. This is the time. It's definitely going to happen now. I'm going to take part in this read along, and that way I'm going to be finally rereading it. But looking at it now, I'm like, wow, this is actually way bigger than I thought it was. It's like somewhere in the 400 pages, and this TBR is very ambitious. So I don't know whether I'll be able to get around to it. So we'll see what ends up happening. I do want to reread it at some point, so it would be perfect to do it. But as I said, who knows? Next up in terms of the rereads, I joined up to be a Patreon for Kate from the channel Kate Feel. I will link her channel down below. And this is in her Patreon group, the goal is that we're going to be buddy reading classics. And so the first buddy read that we're doing started in September, but runs through October, and is for The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. So I read this book last year, I think, and I absolutely loved it. I read it along with a book club, and like with some of my friends who we have a book club with, and they all hated this one. It's very weird, it's very special, and I love weird special stuff. It is very political as well, so there's a whole lot going into it that I am not aware of probably. A whole lot of references to the way in which communist society worked in Russia and things like that. But I absolutely loved it regardless, and I knew from the moment that I finished it, or when I was even still reading it, that I would want to reread it at some point. But yeah, I just don't know whether I'll be able to. And then the final possible reread, which I actually see has a bookmark in it even. I swear, you guys, I did finish this book. But so the final reread is actually for a book that I only have in a bind-up, but I have new editions coming for it, so it would be stupid not to participate in that read-along, right? And so that is The Fellowship of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. So I have this massive original version of the bind-up, because originally The Lord of the Rings was just one book, and that was then just later split. Clearly they weren't used to epic fantasy writers at that time yet, because in total it's just over 1,000, so it's like the same length that Brandon Sanderson's novels are these days. It's the same length as a lot of classics. And so it was split into 3 books, and we are also reading that over the course of 3 months. As with all of these other books, I'm also going to be mentioning the details down below. But so the others in this group have already read The Hobbit in September, but since I listened to the 24-hour Hobbit marathon reading that Andy Serkis did in May, that I thought, like, yeah, I'm not going to read it right after that. I also don't love The Hobbit enough to do that, but I will definitely want to reread The Lord of the Rings, because yeah, I want to give it another go. I read those 8 years ago, 10 years ago maybe, and I remember enjoying, but I definitely love the movies more, and so I'm interested to see what I will think a second time around. Another book that would be for a book club, but this is not a reread, is The Vanished Queen by Lisbeth Campbell. This is for the Of Queens, Witches and Valkyries book club that is being hosted by Sarah from Voyage Through Words. This book is a book centered around a kingdom in which the queen has gone missing, and so the king kind of, I've forgotten the entire premise, but so the king implies that he had nothing to do with it. Well, everybody seems to think that he does, and then her like diaries end up in the hands of our protagonist, who then joins the rebellion to overthrow the king. I think it sounds interesting. I voted for this one. I've forgotten some of the other points to this premise, but I'm also kind of not going to go into them because this TBR is too long, and if I get too excited about this book, I'll get into trouble. So I think there's a possibility of me not reading this one, which would be the first month that I'm not joining in the Of Queens, Witches and Valkyries book club, which would be a shame. So I hope that I will still find the time to do it, but there are only so many days in a month, and there are too many books on my TBR. So let's move on. For the spooky season, I wanted to put a couple of books on there as well. So the first one of these is Little Eyes by Samantha Schweblin. So you think, ah, cute pandas, what's up with that? But then you get this one. So this is all about some sort of like toy, a little bit like a Tamagotchi or something like that. And so these toys or robots or whatever they are very popular, and like everybody's having them, but like on the other side of that toy there's somebody watching, and you can decide whether you want to be the person being watched or whether you want to be the one watching. Yeah, sorry for the cat, but I don't know what's up with her, but she's just being very vocal today. Next up is Dark Places by Gillian Flynn. I have seen that movie, but it's been so long since I've seen that movie that I've forgotten everything. No, it's about some sort of a girl who has a sort of very dark family history that is very well known to people, and that's really everything I know about it at this point. But so I really want to dive into some Gillian Flynn. I was gifted this book. I don't usually like mystery or thriller, just because like it's usually a sort of like whodunit, and I don't really care who done it. I'm really not that interested, so usually those books kind of fall flat for me for that reason. But we'll see. This definitely has a little bit more of the mystery element to it, which I definitely like more than thriller. So yeah, we'll see what I think of this one. Next up, let me talk about Victober. So October is always Victober time, so it's a Victorian literature month in which, as long as you read one Victorian novel, you've participated in Victober. So I know of this read-along because of Lucy the Reader. I will link her channel down below. But she and two other co-hosts created this read-along, and so the goal is to read Victorian literature. There are some prompts and stuff like that, but I'm not going to participate. I'm not going to be participating in any of the prompts. But I did think it was a good opportunity to put the following two books on my TBR, because they are big classics that I definitely want to read at some point in time. First one of these is Wuthering by Emily Brönte. Full disclosure, I have tried this book 2 times, but I never get past the first chapter. But the first chapter is not like, it's a story within a story, let's say. It's just like, the first chapter is set like in the future of the story, and so I have never really gotten into the bulk of the story. I have watched the movie at some point, forgotten a lot about it, but this is so a tragic romance between Catherine and Heathcliff. I think it's just like he is very much looked down upon, and he's very this like dark figure that really isn't making himself very popular, and so it's very much about this tragic romance. And things go down that aren't very positive, but I definitely want to read this one. I want to read the Brontes more. I've only read Jane Eyre. So Wuthering by Emily Brönte, and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. So this one is actually the one that I'm most excited about, because I've heard such great things about this one. So we are following a widow who's kind of a woman who's living in a way that society doesn't think is suitable for a woman on her own. So she's making her own money, sustaining herself, living her own independent life in the country in a time that this wasn't really acceptable. Next up, one of the books of my 2020 TBR. I am not really doing great for the 2020 TBR, but in December I'll have a video about my whole process with that one, and also some reasoning maybe for why I haven't read some of those in the end. But so one that I definitely still do want to read is The English Patient by Mikhail Ondaatje. So I love this movie and I definitely want to read this book, and I recently saw somebody over on Instagram who had read this and who had absolutely adored this, so that really got me excited to pick it back up. So I do definitely want to still try and get it done this year, and so this one is on there. So The English Patient takes place during Second World War, and we are looking at the it takes place in the Second World War, and we have this nurse who is nursing some of these soldiers. One of them is a heavily burned soldier who is like burned beyond recognition and it's like barely hanging on to life, but she reads to him to comfort him. He tells her his life story and his great love story, and I absolutely love this movie and I do definitely want to read the book. Some of the final physical books on here are Weather by Janet Offil, which is a book that has had a lot of buzz surrounding it this year. It was one of my most anticipated reads and I definitely need to pick it up at some point. So I'm not going to go too much into the premise, but because I just don't know too much about the premise, because it was very vague. But so it's supposed to be a little bit going into things like climate and giving us a very bleak view of our future. And then the final one of the physical reads is Actress by Enright, in which we're looking at a daughter's perspective of her mother's rise to fame, or like her mother's life in the spotlights, I think. And yeah, this is another one of those books that I've heard great things about and that I should just finally pick up. I bought this book, so I was very excited at that point, but somehow there are always bigger priorities, and so I definitely want to get around to this one at some point. And then I also do have some audiobooks on my radar. So first one of these is Get Alive, Chloe Brown, which was on my September TBR, but Script took it away from my, I don't know whether it took it away from their library or whether it just wasn't available to me anymore, but it's getting available again on the 1st of October. So that will be my audiobook read. I definitely think I will get around to it because every Monday, for example, I need to take my bicycle to physical therapy. Every Sunday I take my bicycle to my parents, and at those times I'm always listening to an audiobook. So I definitely need an audiobook, so I'm going to be using that one then. Get Alive, Chloe Brown, I've heard great things about. It is a contemporary about a black girl with chronic illness, and I've now forgotten everything else about it, but I'm reading it for its disability representation. And we'll see, because like contemporary romance isn't always my jam, but I have found recently that if it's like combined with something like discussions about racism or about disability representation, that works for me. So hopefully this will also be one of those examples for me. And then I also put 2 books on here that are Booker Prize nominees. In October, the winner for the Booker Prize will be announced. I only have read one of the books at this point, and while it is never my goal to finish the entire long list shortlist before the announcement, I am very much slacking this year, I feel. However, I do also acknowledge that I have other priorities than finishing this list. So I don't actually know whether I'm even going to attempt these books, or whether these might not be the books that fall out rather than the rereads. But so the first one of these that I'm putting on there is The Shadow King by Maaza Mengiste. The books that I'm putting on here for the Booker Prize are books that are on scripts. The reason why there's some haste there is because I've had other years where books for the Booker Prize were on script and then they disappear throughout the year, and I have to find other ways of consuming them, so that's why it would be important to try and read them now. But so The Shadow King by Maaza Mengiste is going to be looking at war, basically. It's going to be looking at Mussolini who tried to invade a country in Africa, and I've forgotten the name now, because I've now forgotten whether it's Somalia or Ethiopia, and it's probably going to be even a different country than the ones that I've just mentioned, of course. It's Ethiopia. So it is a book set around the time that Mussolini tried to invade and try to colonize Ethiopia. And we're looking at a female character within this conflict, and in the way in which she kind of activates the female population to take part in sort of like rebellions or counterattacks or something like that. So it does sound very interesting. That's a given, but there are other books on there that I'm currently more interested in, so I don't know whether I'm going to be prioritizing this reads. And then the final book that I have on here is Shuggie Bain by Douglas Stuart, which I'm very much looking forward to, but it's another case of me not being sure that I want to prioritize it, because it is relatively big. And so this is another Booker Prize nominee, and this is also heavily hinted at as possibly being a winner. And so this is a book that is set in Scotland. The author is Scottish, but he moved to the US, but he is originally Scottish. And so it is a story about our protagonist Shuggie Bain, a young boy growing up in Glasgow, Scotland, in sort of like very much a working class environment. His mother is addicted to alcohol. It's very much going to be looking at substance abuse, at poverty, and I've heard nothing but good things about this book. So I do want to read it a whole lot, but there's just so much that I want to read, and that's always my problem. So in that sense, I always hate making these TBRs, because I'm always like, there's so much that I want to read, and I already know that I'm not going to be able to read all of them. But so yeah, this is my pile of possibilities. I didn't say it at the beginning, but so I use a pile of possibility system. This is not a fixed TBR. I can move books. I can decide to only read 3 of these in the end and to read all other things outside of that list. Or I can stick to it if I really want to. So we'll find out at the end of the month which ones of these I was able to fit into my month and which ones I wasn't. So yeah, see you guys for the next one. Let me know down below if there's any of these books that you've read and that you maybe want to ask me to prioritize, ask me to definitely include in this month's reading. And yeah, you can definitely follow my weekly reading vlogs to find out my progress with them. Hopefully I will also be having another mid-month wrap-up if my reading month goes as productively as I hope it will, as I need it to. But yeah, see you guys. Bye.